What the world thinks they know about Pont-Saint-Esprit in August of 51 is a goddamn fairy tale. The official reports call it mass ergot poisoning, contaminated rye bread making folks see things, making them convulse, driving them to leap from windows. 500 people affected, they say. Just a tragic accident, they say. The papers bought it. The doctors bought it. Hell, I almost bought it myself when they first briefed me. But what I witnessed there, what I helped cover up, God help me. I'm recording this knowing full well that the truth is worse than death. At 72, I don't have much time left anyway. Cancer's eating me up inside. Fitting, considering what I've carried all these years. Back in 1951, I was fresh from the Berlin airlift operations. The brass noticed my knack for quieting situations, keeping panic from spreading when those Soviet bastards tried starving West Berlin. August 20th, I got pulled into a room with men who never introduced themselves. They said they needed someone who could make problems disappear before they reached the papers. Someone with my particular talents. 24 hours later, I was on a military transport to France. I had no idea I was being sent to face something that had no business existing in our world. The official record, as documented by the French authorities and subsequently corroborated by American intelligence, maintains that the incident at Pont-Saint-Esprit in August of 1951 was merely a case of mass ergot poisoning, a mundane explanation for what befell some 500 souls in that ancient village. Those afflicted exhibited symptoms most peculiar, violent convulsions, grotesque visions, and a madness so profound that some hurled themselves from windows to escape the horrors that only they could perceive, all attributed to contaminated rye in the baker's bread by those who dared not contemplate more sinister origins. Shub-Niggurath. There exist, beyond the feeble conceptualization of human ethics, realms where good and evil are but childish constructs, primitive attempts to impose order upon a cosmos that thrives on madness and chaos. What we encountered in that village, what I bear witness to now, it belonged to such a realm. Evil? No. To call it evil would be to dignify it with human meaning. This was something far more disciplined in its chaos, methodical in its madness. When you've stared into an abyss that stares back, with 1,000 eyes that shouldn't exist, when you've heard sounds that restructure your very ability to perceive reality, you understand that our moral frameworks are but flimsy shelters against the hurricane of cosmic indifference. The cultists who summoned this entity believed they were reaching for power, but they were merely offering themselves as vessels to something that regards human consciousness as we might regard the momentary patterns in spilled coffee. I'd been paired with a French intelligence officer. Dumont was his name. They had us wearing these bulky MSA all-service masks and rubberized protective suits. Cutting-edge gear for 51, but more for show than function, I suspect now. We spent 3 days investigating the contaminated areas that the French military had already secured, taking samples of bread, questioning bakers who'd been screened and prepped before we arrived. The whole charade stank worse than the village morgue. By the fourth day, I'd had enough of their misdirection. If you wanted someone to catalog bread mold, I told Dumont, you could have sent a lab technician. Put me on the next flight to Washington so I can personally inform my superiors how the French are keeping secrets from the very allies who ensured they still have a country called France. Bold words from a man who understood nothing. Dumont just stared at me through that mask for the longest time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. We are not concealing truth to protect France, Colonel Weaver. We are protecting you from truth that no man should bear. He removed his mask then, first time in 4 days, revealing a face haunted by something far worse than mere fatigue.
Mais puisque tu insistes pour voir, alors voir, tu verras. Souviens-toi, lorsque les cauchemars viendront, que j'ai tenté de t'épargner ce fardeau. If you insist on seeing, then see you shall. Remember, when the nightmares come, that I tried to spare you this burden.
My arrogance was met first with stupendous humility, then with consuming regret. To this day, I curse myself for not boarding that plane when I had the chance. Some knowledge, some sights, they burrow into your mind like parasites, feeding on your sanity, until nothing remains but the terrible understanding that we are not alone in this universe, and that which accompanies us is beyond indifferent to our existence. Dumont led me deeper into the compound, past areas even the military personnel avoided. We arrived at what had once been a French military training hall, repurposed into something far more sinister. The guards at the entrance wore not just protective gear, but religious symbols from a half-dozen faiths pinned to their uniforms. Later, I learned this wasn't military protocol. The men had added these talismans of their own desperate accord. Prepare yourself, Dumont whispered, his voice hollow with resignation. What lies beyond cannot be unseen. The massive steel doors parted with a pneumatic hiss that seemed to carry within it the faintest echo of distant screams. The stench hit me first, a nauseating fusion of formaldehyde, wet soil, and something else. Something primordial and rotten, like the breath of ancient swamps exhaled into modernity. Inside, under harsh military floodlights, was a tableau that shattered my understanding of biological possibility. The French had transformed the cavernous barrack hall into an improvised containment zone, sealing all exits save for a single observation platform where we now stood, looking down upon a scene from some medieval painting of hell. They had been human once. That much I could discern from the occasional recognizable feature. An eye here, a hand there, fragments of humanity drowning in a sea of aberration. But they were human no longer. Their bodies had become fungal temples to something utterly alien, their flesh erupting into pulpy, iridescent masses that pulsated with unnatural life. Crimson tendrils stretched between victims, creating a grotesque living network that pulsed with synchronous rhythm. Skeletal figures stood among bloated, pustule-covered forms, their bodies elongated and twisted into impossible configurations. From one creature, fruiting bodies erupted from what had been shoulders, unfurling like obscene umbrellas. Another bore cancerous growths arranged with terrible symmetry, forming patterns that my eyes refused to fully process, as if my mind itself was protecting me from some dangerous geometry. Most horrifying was their synchronicity. Over 200 of these things, each uniquely transformed, yet moving with collective purpose. Their misshapen mouths opened and closed in perfect unison, not speaking but chanting, a two-part invocation that seemed to distort the very air with its utterance. Shub, a wet, guttural exhalation from multiple throats. Niggurath, a higher, keening response like wind through dead branches, the name repeated endlessly, a metronome of madness that penetrated not just my ears, but my very consciousness. I felt something ancient and patient taking notice of me through the utterance of that name, a vast awareness turning its attention toward my insignificant existence. They have been like this for days, Dumont explained, his clinical tone betrayed by trembling hands. No food, no water, no sleep, just this endless chant. We tried separating them, but proximity is irrelevant. They remain in perfect synchronization regardless of distance. As if sensing our discussion, every malformed head turned toward us simultaneously. Hundreds of eyes, some human, some decidedly not, fixed upon me with terrible recognition. The chanting stopped, replaced by sudden, suffocating silence. Then, as one, they spoke directly to me.
The messenger has come. 20 of 20. The Dark Mother. The Dark Harvest.
The messenger has come. Their voices merged into a single harmonious abomination of sound. After a moment's terrible pause, they continued in unison. 20 of 20, Dark Mother and the Dark Harvest. Dumont grabbed my arm, his fingers digging painfully into my flesh. "Do not respond," he hissed. "Do not engage."
Shub-Niggurath.
But it was already too late. Something had passed between me and those things. A transmission, a contamination, a covenant. Knowledge wrapped around my consciousness like barbed wire, tightening with each beat of my heart. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that I'd become part of something vast and terrible. Not just a witness, but a participant in cosmic machinations beyond human comprehension. As they spoke this prophecy, a cataclysmic transformation swept through the hall below us. Dumont and I stood rigid on the observation mezzanine, our hands gripping the metal railing as we gazed down upon the circular chamber beneath. In a single, synchronized moment, as if orchestrated by some unseen conductor, each aberration erupted into a miasma of spores, the sickly, bioluminescent cloud illuminating the chamber with an unearthly cyan glow that cast our elongated shadows against the curved wall behind us. From our elevated vantage point, the massive chamber, once perhaps an industrial testing facility or military training arena, had become a writhing sea of biological impossibility. The architecture itself seemed to slowly surrender to the advancing corruption. Metal struts and concrete pillars entwined with glistening crimson sinew and pustulant growths. We both hastily donned our gas masks, fumbling with the straps as the spore cloud billowed upward toward our position. Through the acrid haze, I watched as figures in heavy containment suits moved with practiced precision around the perimeter of the lower level, placing incendiary devices at measured intervals. They worked with the desperate efficiency of men who knew exactly what would happen should their protective gear fail. "They've prepared for this," Dumont's voice was muffled through his respirator. This eruption was anticipated, predicted. Within minutes, the decontamination team had retreated behind blast shields. A siren began its mournful wail as thermite charges ignited in sequence. They immolated the entire chamber where it stood, a pyre of sanitation that sent pillars of tainted smoke curling toward the domed ceiling above. The purifying flames could not, however, cauterize the psychic wound inflicted upon my consciousness. Those terrible, horrendous words of prophecy, 20 of 20 Dark Mother and the Dark Harvest, repeated in my psyche like some accursed phonograph cylinder, etching themselves deeper with each iteration. The voice that carried them transformed with each repetition, modulating from recognizable human cadence into something I cannot begin to describe without risking what tenuous hold on reality I still maintain. The sounds emerged from no earthly larynx, resembling more the stridulations of cosmic insects, or the whispers that might escape from tears in the fabric of existence itself. In that moment of perfect clarity and perfect despair, I silently beseeched Dumont to draw his service weapon and deliver me from this knowledge with a merciful bullet. But looking into his haunted eyes, I recognized that he, too, walked the precarious boundary between sanity and something far worse than mere madness. He had glimpsed the abyss, and within it, the abyss had recognized him, just as it had recognized me. As the flames consumed the grotesque assembly below, casting writhing shadows that seemed to move with purposeful malevolence against the confines of physical law, a terrible suspicion birthed itself within the darkened corridors of my mind. A soldier approached us. His containment suit was pristine military issue, but my eyes were drawn to the peculiar adornments that festooned his gear. Religious symbols from a half-dozen faiths dangled from chains and cords, clicking against one another in discordant rhythm. He carried a square metallic box with a handle, its surface etched with Eldritch symbols I could not comprehend. Without a word, he presented it to Dumont, who accepted it with the reverence one might accord a holy relic, or the caution one might show a primed explosive. Dumont did not open the container. Instead, his trembling fingers traced absent patterns upon its surface as he spoke in hushed tones. Inside is a specimen, a fragment of that which should not be, preserved in a glass containment jar with careful inscriptions etched upon its base. Ancient sigils, meticulously rendered by hands versed in blasphemous geometries beyond mortal understanding. "Tell me, Dumont," I whispered, my voice a brittle thing against the cacophony of purging flame. "Was it truly contaminated bread that brought forth these abominations? Or did men in laboratories not unlike this one call forth that which lurks beyond the veil, only to lose control of powers they had no business commanding? For I perceive now that these containment protocols bear the unmistakable precision of foreknowledge, as if the very catastrophe we witness was but one movement in an orchestration whose terrible symphony has only begun to sound across the hideous vastness separating what is from what must never be. Dumont handed me the sealed case, his eyes revealing a complex alchemy of dread and resignation. As the weight of the box settled in my hands, I felt something within pulse with an unnatural rhythm against my palms through the metallic housing. "And Dumont," I continued, a terrible clarity dawning upon me, "why am I taking this monstrosity as a sample with me? Who exactly is waiting for this?"
The Dark Mother. The Dark Mother. The Dark Harvest.
August 25, 1951. I disembarked at Andrews Air Force Base, the Maryland twilight casting distended shadows across the tarmac that seemed to writhe when glimpsed peripherally. 2 men awaited me, identical charcoal suits, expressionless faces. Not the vacant stare of those who'd witnessed cosmic horror, but the calculating gaze of men driven by ambitions as unfathomable as the ancient beings themselves. Colonel Weaver, the package, if you please, the taller one stated flatly. I relinquished the container with strange reluctance. As it left my possession, I felt some tenuous psychic tether severed, both liberating and oddly bereft. "You will accompany us, Colonel," the man pronounced. "There are questions which must be addressed." Our destination was a nondescript building on Bethesda's outskirts. Behind its bureaucratic facade lay a subterranean complex accessed through an elevator concealed behind a maintenance closet. We descended far beyond rational expectation, pressure changes causing discomfort to both ear and mind. Finally reaching its terminus, the doors opened to reveal a concrete corridor lit by shadowless fluorescent lights, an unnatural absence that heightened, rather than diminished, my mounting dread. At the corridor's terminus, we encountered twin doors adorned with inscriptions of such geometric precision and antiquity that the eye, following their patterns, experienced a subtle vertigo. These opened silently upon our approach, revealing a chamber wherein 3 men sat equidistant around a circular desk of obsidian aspect. The trio wore silver-hooded cloaks that momentarily evoked ecclesiastical associations, as though the Catholic Church had dispatched members of some arcane papacy for an exorcism of unprecedented gravity. Yet closer observation dispelled this impression. Their garments bore symbols that no Vatican conclave would sanction, and they carried themselves with an authority suggesting they answered to powers beyond any earthly church. The table, though superficially resembling polished stone, possessed qualities that defied terrestrial geology, its surface absorbing rather than reflecting the harsh institutional lighting, creating an impression of boundless depth. More disturbing still were the symbols inlaid upon its circumference, which began to emit a faint luminescence as the container approached, pulsing with the unmistakable rhythm of a living heart. One of my escorts unsealed the case and withdrew the specimen jar, a seamless glass vessel devoid of any discernible opening, as though the vitreous material had been somehow formed around its contents in defiance of conventional craftsmanship. Within, suspended in clear fluid, rested a fragment of that which I had witnessed in Pont-Saint-Esprit, a thing that should not exist in our reality. I maintained a rigid military bearing, decades of discipline preventing outward displays of the disquiet that threatened to overwhelm my faculties. Yet beneath this practiced composure, fundamental certainties were rapidly eroding, not merely regarding the specimen's impossible nature, but concerning these men who regarded it with such clinical detachment. Their identities remained obscure, yet their authority was absolute, suggesting a power structure operating in parallel to, yet separate from, the governance I had sworn to serve. None of these robed figures offered introductions or appellations, not even the courtesy of falsified identities to establish some pretense of conventional dialogue. Such trivial social formalities seemed beneath their concern, as though they operated in a sphere where human protocols were vestigial remnants of a reality they had long transcended. The atmosphere within that chamber pulsed with a palpable chaos, not the disordered chaos of randomness, but something primal and purposeful that resonated at frequencies just beyond human perception. My thoughts seemed to drift untethered, fragmenting into voids between coherence, until the central figure broke the oppressive silence. He spoke without apparent movement of lips beneath his silver hood, his voice manifesting directly within the chamber, as though air itself reluctantly formed his words. 20 of 20? A pause, pregnant with cosmic significance. The Dark Mother. Another pause, during which I felt reality constrict around us. The Dark Harvest. Then, with an intimacy that violated something deeper than mere privacy, he addressed me not by rank or surname, but by a name I had abandoned to military formality decades prior. James. Mine own baptismal appellation, falling from that nameless entity's unseen lips, struck upon my consciousness with a violence surpassing any corporeal assault, a transgression more intimate and profound than the most invasive espionage could achieve. Within that singular utterance lay irrefutable evidence that these presences, for I could no longer sustain the comforting delusion that they were men in any sense comprehensible to our species, possessed knowledge of my being that transcended the boundaries of governmental archives and military ledgers, extending perhaps into realms where the very essence of identity is laid bare beneath the cold scrutiny of inhuman perception. The central figure's continued discourse emanated not from any discernible orifice beneath its argent cowl, but seemed rather to originate from some unfathomable point in space coincident with, yet not precisely located within, the physical form before me. Your faculty of intuition serves you faithfully, James. The syllables manifested not as auditory phenomena, but as preternatural reverberations within the labyrinthine architecture of my cranial vault, each word a sepulchral echo awakening dormant chambers of sensation heretofore unknown to me. The companion of doubt shall render you no succor in this sphere, and as for truth, here the entity's utterance underwent a hideous modulation, ascending and descending through tonal registers that no terrestrial larynx could produce, generating infinitesimal ruptures in the very substance of reality between us. A caesura that expanded like some vast cosmic maw, threatening to devour all epistemological certainty within its lightless depths. Truth begets consequences more dire than your finite mind can encompass. The figure inclined slightly forward, its hooded vestment capturing and refracting illumination at angles, which violated the fundamental principles of optics, revealing prismatic colorations that could not possibly exist within the uniform phosphorescence of that chamber. A profound stillness descended upon the assembly, as though the very molecules of air had momentarily ceased their eternal motion. When the central entity resumed its communication, the psychic impact of its words struck my consciousness with such force that I staggered physically, my military bearing momentarily abandoned. "You bear her mark now, James Weaver," the entity intoned, each syllable a serpentine vibration that coiled through the interstices of my mind. The black goat of the woods, with 1,000 young she who walks among the stars, the mother of absolute chaos. Her unfathomable awareness now encompasses your infinitesimal existence. My knees threatened to buckle as comprehension bloomed like some malignant flower within my understanding. The dreams that had plagued me since Pont-Saint-Esprit, visions of cosmic voids populated by writhing geometries and pulsating organic architectures that defied Euclidean principles. These were not mere psychological reactions to trauma, but something far more sinister, direct perceptions of an alien consciousness that had somehow entangled itself with my own. From the moment her transformed children recognized you as messenger, from the instant that recognition passed between your consciousness and theirs, an indelible connection was established. The entity's cowl inclined toward the specimen jar, which now pulsated with a bioluminescence that seemed synchronized with my own heartbeat. And in delivering this fragment of her essence, this precious distillation of her manifestation, you have completed a circuit of exchange. You have participated, however unwittingly, in a transaction of cosmic significance. I recalled with sickening clarity the bizarre synchronicity with which the transformed victims had turned toward me in that French containment facility, their distorted voices merging in uncanny harmony to address me directly. The messenger has come. Not a misidentification, as I had desperately wished to believe, but a recognition of a role I had been unconsciously assigned in some vast, incomprehensible drama. She observes you now, James Weaver, the entity continued, its telepathic emanations carrying undertones of what in a human interlocutor might have suggested reverence or perhaps envy. Through the dimensional membranes that separate your reality from hers, her attention has fixed upon your particular neurological constellation. The dreams you experience represent merely the most rudimentary manifestations of this surveillance, the barest filaments of her consciousness brushing against yours, causing ripples in your perception that your brain desperately attempts to contextualize through familiar cognitive frameworks. The implications of this revelation cascaded through my consciousness with devastating force. The entity was suggesting not merely that I had been observed or selected, but that I had been fundamentally altered, that my very being now served as a permeable membrane through which an incomprehensible cosmic entity maintained awareness of our dimension. The specimen jar, with its imprisoned fragment of that which had transformed the citizens of Pont-Saint-Esprit, seemed suddenly to radiate malevolence, not as an inert biological sample, but as a living extension of something vast and hungry, something for which human consciousness represented not a mystery to be respected, but a resource to be harvested. Then, by some mad impulse, as though a long-dormant fragment of my soul had issued a final, desperate declaration of rebellion against these overwhelming cosmic horrors, I found myself forfeiting all cowardice and despair. The accumulated military discipline of decades abruptly reasserted itself, and I drew myself to full height. "Stop!" I roared, my voice shattering the oppressive atmosphere with unexpected violence. "No more!" The hooded figures remained motionless, yet I sensed a perturbation in the psychic atmosphere. Perhaps surprise, though I hesitate to ascribe human emotional categories to entities so manifestly alien. "Whatever you or whoever is responsible for the deliberate murders of innocent lives," I continued, my voice gaining solidity with each word, "I am not part of this and never will be. And whatever this Dark Mother is," here I gestured contemptuously toward the specimen jar, its contents now writhing with apparent agitation, "for I know one thing with absolute certainty. You are confessing in plain language to the cultivation of a biological weapon administered on our allies. My rational faculties, so long subdued by metaphysical terror, reasserted themselves with unexpected clarity. The elaborate cosmological framework presented by these entities, dimensional membranes, cosmic cycles, eldritch deities, suddenly struck me as an elaborate obfuscation of mundane, if horrific, reality. If I had my weapon with me, I declared with cold precision, you would be lying flat on this floor. So tell me this, after all these formalities, are you intending to pin this atrocity on me? Have me believe an alien being orchestrated this abomination? This specimen is nothing more than a mutated virus your organization has created as an apparatus of biological warfare, dressed up in fairy tales to manipulate my perception. The absurdity of my defiance in such circumstances was not lost on me, yet I pressed onward, driven by a desperate need to reassert human agency in the face of overwhelming cosmic indifference, or perhaps merely to construct a more comprehensible narrative than the one presented. You do realize, I concluded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, that if I leave this place, I will bring down the full might of the United States military upon your heads. My declaration hung in the air, its bold insolence seeming to ripple through the chamber's oppressive atmosphere. I anticipated some display of anger, perhaps even retribution for my impudence. Instead, after a prolonged silence that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of normal temporal perception, the central hooded figure merely adjusted its posture, settling back into a position of disconcerting ease that suggested not alarm but something far more unsettling. A profound, cosmic patience. If that is what you believe the truth to be, Colonel Weaver, the entity replied, its voice now modulated to more closely approximate human intonation, an adjustment that somehow struck me as more condescending than conciliatory, then you are indeed free to depart this assemblage. The casual dismissal of my threats produced in me a surge of indignation, quickly supplanted by confusion as the entity continued. However, I would counsel you to remember this date and this encounter with particular attentiveness, it continued, the measured cadence of its words carrying the inexorable weight of prophecy rather than threat. In 1971, these events shall recur. The cycle progresses with mathematical precision, indifferent to human belief or disbelief. A peculiar disorientation overtook me at these words, not the vertiginous terror that had characterized my earlier responses to the entity's pronouncements, but rather a cold, analytical dread born of the statement's specificity. Why 1971? Why precisely 20 years hence? The arbitrary yet confident precision of this prediction disturbed me more profoundly than any cosmic philosophy. Most curious of all, the figure concluded, its cowl inclining toward me with what I can only describe as perverse amusement. You yourself shall occupy the position I now hold. You shall sit where I now sit, and you shall impart these identical revelations to the next messenger, who will respond with equivalent skepticism to that which you now display. Something in me snapped at this pronouncement, this casual assertion of my predetermined role in their cosmic charade. Military training had instilled in me a fundamental belief in human agency, in the capacity to make decisions and alter outcomes through force of will. This prophecy represented the antithesis of such conviction. If you're so certain of yourself and these predictions, I challenged, my voice steadier than I felt, why hide your face in such obscurity? Why not show me who, or what, you truly are? The hooded figure remained motionless for several seconds, its silvery cowl directed toward me with an intensity I could feel despite the absence of visible eyes. Then, with deliberate slowness, it tilted its head, a gesture so eerily familiar that it sent a premonitory shudder through my frame, before, I could consciously identify its significance. "Of course," the figure replied, its telepathic voice modulating into tones that awakened an awful recognition within me. "If you want to see, then see you shall." Those precise words, "then see you shall," struck me with paralyzing force. They were the exact phrase Dumont had uttered before leading me into the French containment barracks, before exposing me to the horror that initiated this nightmare. The statistical impossibility of such identical phrasing momentarily overwhelmed my analytical faculties, creating a cognitive vacuum into which poured a flood of terrible suspicion. With ceremonial deliberation, the figure raised hands clad in silver-hued gloves to the edges of its hood. As the fabric was drawn back, revealing the face beneath, the fundamental architecture of my comprehension collapsed entirely. There, regarding me with eyes that contained both recognition and unfathomable alienness, sat Dumont. Not Dumont as I had known him in France, the exhausted, haunted intelligence officer whose humanity had been evident even in his horror. But Dumont transformed. His features retained their basic structural identity, yet were subtly altered in ways that defied precise cataloging. His skin possessed a quality simultaneously desiccated and unnaturally vital, as though organic tissue had been replaced, with some substance that mimicked life without truly embodying it. His eyes, once merely haunted, now contained depths that suggested consciousness extending far beyond the physical confines of his skull. In that moment of recognition, as the implications of this revelation began their catastrophic cascade through my consciousness, the chamber, the obsidian table, Dumont's transformed visage, all were abruptly occluded by absolute darkness, as though reality itself had been extinguished. Cold droplets striking my face penetrated the void of unconsciousness, each impact a minute shock drawing me incrementally toward awareness. Through the darkness came a voice, distant at first, then gaining clarity with persistent repetition.
Jamais, jamais, jamais. You must get up, jamais. Quickly now, jamais.
The familiarity of that voice triggered an autonomic response, my military training compelling a return to consciousness, despite the mind's instinctive retreat from whatever horrors awaited. I opened my eyes with reluctance born of recent memory, my vision gradually resolving from indistinct shapes into a face hovering above mine, a face that caused my heart to seize with momentary terror. Dumont. Not the transformed entity whose revelation had preceded my blackout, but Dumont as I had known him in France. Haggard, human, his features etched with apparent concern rather than cosmic detachment. Rain streamed down his face, plastering his hair to his forehead as he leaned over me. "You must get up," he urged, his French accent more pronounced than I recalled, perhaps exacerbated by evident anxiety. "Quickly, James." Before I could formulate response or question, darkness claimed me once more, not the instantaneous void of my previous experience, but rather the gradual dissolution of consciousness that suggests ordinary syncope. The image of Dumont's worried countenance lingered briefly, then dispersed like smoke in a strong breeze. My second emergence into consciousness was more gradual. I became aware first of the persistent rhythm of rainfall, heavy droplets striking my exposed skin with metronomic regularity. Then came the subtle motion beneath me, not the solid stability of the chamber floor, but something that yielded slightly, accompanied by a faint grinding sound with each shift of my weight. When I finally managed to open my eyes, I beheld not institutional lighting, but the boundless canopy of a night sky, occluded by roiling storm clouds, intermittently illuminated by distant lightning that transformed the suspended raindrops into momentary constellations of falling light. I sat upright with effort, my sodden uniform adding considerable weight to movements already hampered by disorientation. My surroundings refused immediate classification. I found myself perched upon a massive, flat-topped rock formation that protruded from what appeared to be a shoreline. The stone beneath me was not the polished obsidian of that subterranean chamber, but rough granite, slick with rainwater and occasional splashes from nearby waves. June 17th, 1998. The camcorder's red light blinks with mechanical indifference, the only witness to what may be my final testament. My withered hands adjust the frame, ensuring that whatever poor soul discovers this recording will see my face clearly. A map of 72 years worth of lines and shadows, each etched by horrors most men mercifully never comprehend. I take a deep breath, steadying myself against the tremors that have become my constant companions. Not mere symptoms of age, but rather the physical manifestation of a consciousness perpetually straining against cosmic intrusion. Reality, I begin, the word itself now a cruel joke, or what passes for real in the decades since Pont-Saint-Esprit. It makes no sense. The boundaries between what is and what cannot be have dissolved like tissue paper in acid. I wish this burden on no one. The cancer eating through my body seems almost merciful now. A conventional end to an existence that long ago ceased to be conventional. I pause, considering the futility of this endeavor. Who would believe? Who could comprehend? Yet I continue, driven by the same desperate hope that has sustained me through decades of this waking nightmare. You may wonder why I bother recording this confession, why expose another soul to knowledge that has devoured my sanity like moths through an ancient tapestry. Because I have managed, through means I will explain, to interrupt the cycle twice now, in 1971 and again in 1991. But I am at my end now, if such a concept retains any meaning when one exists partially outside linear temporality. I lean closer to the camera, my rheumy eyes suddenly sharp with urgency. Whoever finds this videotape hidden among mundane entertainments at the rental store, if you cannot bear the weight of what I'm about to reveal, I implore you to pass this recording to someone who might. Do not dismiss me as delusional or these events as fabrication. If you have watched this far, you may already be experiencing phenomena beyond rational explanation, dreams populated by non-Euclidean architectures, moments of lost time, perhaps even glimpses of figures at the periphery of your vision that vanish when directly observed. The weight of responsibility, of cosmic guilt, presses down upon me as I continue. My voice drops to a haunted whisper that the microphone barely captures. If I could have spared you this life sentence, this conscription into a war beyond human comprehension, I would have. But time, that construct we so naively consider immutable, has never been on my side. It bends and folds according to her will, not ours. and she has marked you just as surely as she marked me in that French village all those years ago. The camera's unblinking eye captures my momentary hesitation as I drift back to that impossible shore, the crossroads where my life as Colonel James Weaver, decorated military officer, ended, and my existence as something else, something marked, truly began. As I stood upon that rain-slicked stone, attempting to orient myself in space if not in sanity, my gaze was drawn to the horizon. What I beheld there defies articulation through conventional language. Vast apertures yawned open across the boundary where sea met sky, colossal geometries that folded and unfolded themselves like obscene origami, operating according to principles that violated every physical law I had ever known. These rifts, for lack of a more precise term, would manifest with stunning suddenness, their edges pulsating with bioluminescence that corresponded to no terrestrial spectrum, before collapsing back into apparent nothingness as though reality itself were breathing through lacerated lungs. My cognitive faculties, still reeling from the discontinuity of my translocation from that subterranean chamber, could not process these phenomena. The mind, when confronted with the genuinely impossible, constructs elaborate barriers of denial. It recategorizes, it rationalizes, it simply refuses to perceive. Yet these merciful mechanisms had already been systematically dismantled by my encounter with the transformed victims of Pont-Saint-Esprit and the entity wearing Dumont's face. I saw, and in seeing, was forever changed. I paused to swallow a pill from the orange bottle beside me, not for the physical pain, but for the tremors that intensify whenever I venture too deeply into recollection. Finding no other recourse, I abandoned the relative safety of that stone platform and chose the path that led toward the dense forest rather than the volatile seascape. The decision was not born of logic or military assessment, but of the primal instinct that drives all organisms toward cover when exposed in hostile territory. Upon crossing the threshold where barren shore yielded to tangled vegetation, I encountered a phenomenon more subtly terrifying than the horizon's cosmic violations. The forest was wrapped in a silence so complete, so absolute, that it transcended mere absence of sound. The verdant canopy above me swayed in what appeared to be substantial wind, branches bending, leaves fluttering, yet produced no auditory accompaniment. The chittering insects, the rustling undergrowth, the calls of birds that should have populated such an environment, all were absent. Only the rhythmic percussion of the distant surf penetrated this unnatural silence, although by all acoustic principles, those marine sounds should have been the first to diminish upon entering the dense woodland. having witnessed the biological impossibilities in France and confronted entities that seemed to exist partially outside our dimensional framework in that Bethesda facility, I might have expected to meet this new impossibility with battle-hardened stoicism. Yet this selective silence affected me more profoundly than the more spectacular violations of natural law I had previously endured. My aged face contorts as I struggle to articulate what follows. What I experienced then was not fear, fear being a comprehensible emotional response with evolutionary utility. No. What seized me in that soundless forest was something far more fundamental. A complete ontological dislocation, a severance from the basic assumptions that allow human consciousness to function within reality's framework. If language contained nomenclature for such a state, it would not be found in dictionaries of psychology, but in forbidden lexicons penned by madmen who glimpsed what rides beyond the veil of consensual reality. Temporal perception within that silent forest operated according to principles I cannot adequately explain. What felt like hours might have been minutes. What seemed brief interludes may have encompassed days. The position of the sun, if indeed it was our sun, remained obscured by the dense canopy, offering no celestial guidance. My military-issue watch had ceased functioning, its hands frozen at the precise moment I had first beheld Dumont's transformed visage beneath that silver hood. I possessed no reliable means to measure my passage through that nameless woodland. Only the progressive deterioration of my uniform's dampness and the growing hollowness in my stomach provided any evidence of time's continued progression. After traversing what might have been leagues or merely yards, for spatial relationships, like temporal ones, seemed to obey alternative geometries in that place. The dense vegetation abruptly terminated at the edge of a precipitous escarpment. I dropped instinctively to a prone position, the soldier's reflex for concealment manifesting even as my rational faculties struggled to process the tableau spread before me. Below stretched a circular clearing of barren earth, devoid of vegetation, as though the soil itself had been rendered sterile by some profound desecration. This natural amphitheater was inscribed with markings that, even from my elevated vantage point, provoked an instinctive revulsion. Precise geometric configurations that seemed to oscillate subtly when observed directly, as though the very act of perception caused them to shift between dimensional states. I reach for a glass of water, the camera capturing this moment of weakness. This evidence of how thoroughly the memory unmoors me even decades later. Within this clearing stood a solitary figure, a man draped in garments of such antiquated design and material that they appeared more like integumentary extensions of his flesh than conventional attire. Dark, tattered fabrics rippled around his form, seeming to absorb rather than reflect what meager light penetrated that accursed place. At 5 equidistant points surrounding him, forming a perfect pentagrammic configuration, lay what I initially assumed were bundles of cloth or primitive effigies. A pressure began to build within my cranium, not the familiar pounding of stress-induced hypertension, but something more invasive, as though some external consciousness were attempting to establish residence within the architecture of my mind. This intrusion brought with it a certainty, a compulsion. I must bear witness to what was unfolding below, not merely as passive observer, but as designated chronicler, as though my very presence had been orchestrated across vast temporal gulfs for this specific purpose. When the figure began to vocalize, the sounds that emerged bore only superficial resemblance to human speech. The phonemic structures suggested tremendous antiquity, not merely pre-modern or ancient, but primordial, as though the very roots of all human language were being excavated from geological strata of consciousness. Scholars might have classified it as some Proto-Semitic tongue, but such academic categorization would be woefully inadequate to capture its fundamental alienness. Yet it was not this linguistic abomination that truly shattered my remaining bulwarks of sanity. Rather, it was the sudden inexplicable knowledge that arrived not through deduction or recognition, but through direct insertion into my consciousness of the man's identity. With a certainty that transcended faith or conviction, I knew that I gazed upon Cain, the firstborn son of biblical Adam, the primal murderer, the original exile from human community. I lean closer to the camera, my rheumy eyes suddenly clear with the terrible lucidity that only terminal illness can grant. Not a metaphorical Cain, you understand. Not some delusional zealot adopting mythological identity to sanctify atrocity. The literal historical progenitor of fratricide, preserved across millennia not through divine punishment as scripture suggests, but through unholy covenant with something far more ancient than any biblical deity. What I witnessed was an iterative ritual, the original sacrifice replayed across time's vast canvas, the reverberations of which have shaped humanity's collective consciousness far more fundamentally than our species can comprehend. The most profound violations of natural law are those that transform not external reality, but one's internal mechanisms of perception. As Cain's utterances continued, a metamorphosis occurred within my auditory processing, a reconfiguration of neural pathways that should have been immutable. The incomprehensible syllables cascading from his lips did not simply reach my ears as sound and remain impenetrable. They underwent a translation process that bypassed conventional linguistic centers entirely. I understood him, you see, not through cognition, not through familiarity with his primordial tongue, but through a form of apprehension that operated at the level of raw sensation. The meanings emerged not as conceptual units, assembled from phonemic components, but as direct emotional and sensory impressions that bloomed within my consciousness like malignant flowers. His words, if such terrestrial terminology can be applied to those utterances, manifested as tactile sensations along my spine, as chromatic aberrations at the periphery of my vision, as metallic tastes upon my tongue, as olfactory phantoms that evoked epochs of decay. The ritual he conducted was not merely directed towards some entity beyond conventional perception. It was simultaneously creating and had already created the very conditions that enabled its own existence across temporal boundaries. I perceived with horrifying clarity that what I witnessed was not a discrete historical event, but rather a node in a vast hyperdimensional lattice of causality that extended backward to the dawn of terrestrial consciousness and forward beyond the theoretical heat-death of our universe. Such comprehension should have obliterated my sanity instantly. The human mind is evolutionarily equipped to process linear causality within extremely limited spatial and temporal parameters. To perceive even a fragment of this cosmic recursion should have resulted in immediate psychological dissolution, a complete separation from consensus reality as the mind desperately attempts to protect itself through categorical dissociation. Why I did not perish in that moment, why my consciousness did not simply extinguish itself rather than continue to process information fundamentally incompatible with its basic operating parameters, remains perhaps the most persistent question of my tortured existence. Was I preserved by some innate resilience unique to my neurological constitution? Was I maintained as conscious witness by the same entity that had arranged my presence at this primordial scene? Or was my continued functionality evidence of a more disturbing possibility, that human consciousness is far more elastic in its capacity to accommodate cosmic horror than our species has been permitted to discover? Whatever the explanation, I endured. I remained cognizant, processing revelations that should have been intellectually and perceptually inaccessible. In retrospect, I understand this sustained awareness not as mercy, but as the cruelest possible sentence, the capacity to comprehend one's own fundamental reconfiguration as it occurs, to bear witness to the dissolution of the boundaries between self and that which should never be contained within human awareness. What transpired next defies articulation through any linguistic framework developed for human communication. As Cain's ritual reached its apotheosis, the very substance of reality began to rupture before my eyes, not metaphorically, you understand, but with the literal manifestation of spatial discontinuity. The air itself seemed to develop a seam, a suture in the epidermis of our dimension that gradually parted like necrotic tissue yielding to corruption. Through this aperture emerged something that my visual cortex interpreted as an eye, though that mundane anatomical designation profoundly fails to encompass its true nature. This was not an organ of sight in any conventional sense, but rather a nexus of awareness. A concentrated point of perception belonging to something that existed primarily in dimensions orthogonal to our own, extending an infinitesimal fragment of its consciousness into our reality like a fisherman might dangle a lure into dark waters. Its iris, if such terrestrial terminology can be applied, contained chromatic variations that should not exist within our visible spectrum, colors that I perceived not through optical reception, but through some faculty that had no prior existence within my neuroanatomy. The pupil was not merely an absence of light, but an absence of being itself, a perfect negation that seemed to consume rather than reflect the photons that encountered it. Most disturbing of all was the immediate, unequivocal certainty that this entity perceived me specifically, that across the impossible gulf separating my concealed observation point from the ritual site below, it had detected my presence with perfect precision. Not merely my physical location, understand, but the totality of my being, my history, my molecular composition, my cognitive architecture, the quantum states of particles comprising my nervous system. I was, in that moment, more thoroughly known than any human has ever been known by another. Then came the sound. To call it a shriek suggests auditory properties that existed solely within conventional acoustic parameters. This emanation operated simultaneously across multiple sensory modalities. It was sound, yes, but also chromatic disruption, dermal sensation, olfactory hallucination, gustatory assault. It bypassed the cochlear mechanisms of my ears and resonated directly within the deeper structures of my brain, activating neural pathways that should have remained dormant throughout human evolution. This was no mere communication, but a fundamental reprogramming, a commandment encoded within the very vibrations that temporarily suspended the laws of physics in that clearing. Within this impossible utterance lay the explicit articulation of a covenant established at the dawn of conscious thought, a pact sealed between primordial humanity and that which preceded and will outlast our species. I understood with perfect clarity that I had been conscripted into a lineage stretching back to the mythological foundations of civilization, bound by the same obligations that had preserved Cain through millennia of wandering. The pressure built within my skull as the sonic assault intensified, each modulation corresponding to the systematic deconstruction of another cognitive bulwark. I felt the barriers between conscious and unconscious thought dissolving, witnessed the collapse of the categorical distinctions my mind had constructed to impose order upon sensory data. As the sounds reached an impossible crescendo, I sensed something like an immense curtain being drawn across my perception, as though what I had witnessed was precisely the measure of revelation I was permitted, neither more nor less. My consciousness receded not into oblivion, but into a carefully orchestrated absence, my last coherent thought being that I had been shown exactly what I needed to see, no more and no less. After that, what I am about to say will not make any sense, but I must relate it exactly as it occurred, without embellishment or rationalization. I leaned forward, my weathered face filling the frame. I woke up in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, specifically in a densely wooded area near Lake Placid. I recognized the location immediately, having spent summers there as a child before the war. The transition was absolute. No intervening awareness, no sense of travel or passage. One moment I had been witnessing that primordial abomination in what I can only assume was some distant epoch or parallel reality. The next, I lay upon a bed of pine needles in a forest that represented the most mundane certainty of my American upbringing. The juxtaposition was so severe, so absolute in its cognitive dissonance, that for several minutes I simply lay there, listening to the entirely ordinary sounds of birds and insects, sounds that had been conspicuously absent in that other forest. The normality of my surroundings seemed almost obscene after what I had witnessed, like a crude parody of reality constructed specifically to mock my shattered perceptions. But something was off, I continue, my rheumy eyes narrowing as I recall the disorientation. The vegetation seemed marginally different, more mature in some areas, younger in others than I remembered from my childhood visits. As I navigated through the woodland toward civilization, I eventually emerged, near a Texaco filling station just off Route 73. It was there that reality truly fractured around me. Parked beside the pumps were automobile models I had never encountered, designs that seemed both familiar, yet subtly advanced, beyond what I had known. The station itself bore signage and price listings that sent a wave of vertigo through me. Gasoline at 27 cents per gallon. Impossible. I stood frozen, the newspaper quivering in my grasp, as a young black attendant in a Texaco uniform approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Something else, ain't it?" he remarked with genuine enthusiasm, gesturing toward the newspaper headline. "First Catholic president. My grandmother said she'd never see the day. Makes you think maybe Dr. King is right. Maybe things really are changing. Who knows? Might even see a colored man in the White House someday." He laughed at what seemed to him an outlandish proposition, though his eyes held genuine hope. I must have presented a concerning spectacle, a man in soiled, outdated clothing staring at a newspaper as though it were written in hieroglyphics. The young man's expression shifted from conversational warmth to cautious concern. "You all right, mister?" he asked, maintaining a respectful distance that spoke volumes about the social realities of the era in which I had inexplicably arrived. "You need me to call someone for you?" I gave the kid the number I had for emergencies, for agents needing safe house. I thought, what more can go wrong? My taste for chaos and madness had been so forged that at this point, everything else was just trivial or jest at best. "Would you mind placing this call for me? Just tell whoever answers that Colonel James Weaver requires immediate assistance." Looking into that young man's concerned eyes, so ordinary, so blessedly untouched by cosmic awareness, I experienced a moment of cognitive bifurcation. One part of me, the military officer who had navigated diplomatic crises and battlefield chaos, recognized the need for prudent action, establish contact, acquire resources, gather intelligence. Another part, the part forever altered by what I had witnessed in that primordial clearing, regarded the entire situation with a detached, almost nihilistic amusement. As he moved toward the payphone at the edge of the lot, I experienced a wave of what I can only describe as perverse amusement. What could any government agency possibly do for me now? What safe house could shelter someone whose consciousness had been permanently altered to perceive beyond the veil? Whatever organization answered that call would be confronting a scenario so far outside their operational parameters that their response would be, at best, a bureaucratic pantomime, a performance of control in the face of the genuinely uncontrollable. Yet I allowed the process to unfold, watching with detached fascination as the young man dialed and spoke quietly into the receiver. His expression shifted subtly as he listened to the response. Surprise, perhaps a touch of intimidation. When he returned, his demeanor had changed entirely, a new respect or perhaps wariness evident in his posture. "Sir," he said, the informal friendliness replaced with deference. "They said a car will be here within 20 minutes. I gestured toward a metal stool beside the station's small office window. "I'll just sit right here," I told him, settling my weight onto the seat with deliberate casualness. "Get me a pack of whatever they smoke these days." He nodded and disappeared into the small convenience store, returning moments later with a pack of Marlboros, the red and white packaging somehow more vibrant than I remembered. "Filters are all the rage now," he explained hesitantly as he handed me the cigarettes and a book of matches. I examined the pack briefly, tapped out a cigarette and lit it, drawing the smoke deep into my lungs with complete indifference. After witnessing cosmic horror, lung cancer seemed a quaintly conventional concern. The nicotine provided a familiar chemical anchor to reality, perhaps the only familiar sensation in this dislocated existence. "I'll just wait for them here," I said, exhaling a plume of smoke that drifted lazily in the crisp January air. As I sat watching vehicles pass on Route 73, their designs subtly evolved from those I had known, I experienced a profound dissociation. The cigarette burned between my fingers. The cold January air bit at my exposed skin. The mundane sounds of the gas station provided an auditory backdrop of pure normalcy. Yet I inhabited these sensations as an observer rather than a participant, as though my consciousness floated slightly adjacent to physical reality, never again to be fully integrated with it.